Okay, hello everyone. Thank you very much for coming to today's SFP Greater London Student Chapter webinar. I'm very pleased to say that we've got a great speaker for you today from the NFPA, the National Fire Protection Association. We have Birgitte Messerschmidt, who will be talking to us about fire safety in the US since 1980, an analysis of fire statistics. Should be very interesting. Just some quick housekeeping first. If you're new to our webinars, there should be a little Q&A tab accessible to you. If you have any questions that come to mind during the seminar, please just post them there. I'll be keeping track of them and publishing them and stuff. And at the end of the seminar, we'll ask them, and Birgitte will try to answer as many as she can. And yeah, also, if you haven't seen our webinars before and you'd like to keep up with them, remember to follow us on Twitter at SFP London. But without further ado, I think I should hand over to Birgitte. Birgitte, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm looking very forward to this.
Well, thank you, Matt, for having me. Although I'm a little intimidated after your song. I'm afraid you now expect me to break out into song, and I'd rather not. So if it's okay with you, I'll just stay without singing.
That's okay. We'll allow it.
That sounds good. All right. I assume that I can start sharing my screen.
That's all good.
Let's see. Nope, that was the wrong one. Stop presenting. Yeah, I got into the wrong one. Let's see if we can have a little bit more luck on this one here, because I got my Teams open. All right, come on, we can do this. Here we go, SFP London chapter presentation. All right. How does that look, Matt?
Yeah, all looks good to me.
Perfect. All right, let's go. So thank you so much for inviting me today to present on this study here. I'm really excited to tell you about the research that we've done on this, because even though I'm going to talk about data from the United States, I do believe that we can learn from this around the globe. So yeah, let's dive into it. First, a little bit about NFPA, National Fire Protection Association, since I'm not sure if you all are familiar with us. We are a global nonprofit organization that was established in 1896. So this year is our 125th anniversary. And we are devoted to eliminating death, injury, property, and economic loss due to fire, electrical, and related hazards. And our mission is to help save lives and reduce loss with information, knowledge, and passion. So I hope to provide some information, knowledge, and passion to you here today. A little bit about me. For those of you that don't know me, I have worked in fire safety for, it's now 27 years. It shocks me every time I say that, but it is 27 years. Started out in the mid-90s at DPI in Denmark, where I'm originally from, doing testing, standards, and research. Then changed over to Rockwell for about 16 years. Worked there on standards, research, and public affairs. And then since 2017, I have been with NFPA here in the US, working on applied research, fire analysis, and outreach. So really spanned a lot of interesting stuff during my career, and it's super interesting now to be in the more of the data and fire analysis part, seeing some of these things that I've worked on my entire career coming together to some extent. So what I'm going to talk to you about is this study that we published in June from NFPA that is called Fire Safety in the United States since 1980. That is through the lens of the NFPA Fire and Life Safety Ecosystem. And there's the web address for where you can go and download the report. It's a 60-some page report. And if you have an interest in the data I'm talking about today, I definitely encourage you to go in and check it out. And I would like to give a shout out to my amazing co-author, Marty Ahrens. She's the one who did all the data work on this report. And I mean, she is our NFIRST data goddess at NFPA. So this work would not have happened without her. Why are we looking at it? So I want to take a little bit of a step back in time, back to 1973, where the seminal report called America Burning was published. It was really, they were looking at, the United States had a problem. I realized we have a problem. We have way too many fires and way too many people dying in fires. So they really looked at what do we need to do about that. And this whole report, if you haven't read it, is extremely interesting reading. And some of the major conclusions from that was that there needed to be much more emphasis on fire prevention, that Americans must be educated about fire safety. And I think that goes around the world. It's not just Americans, people in general need to be educated about fire safety. And the fire protection features of buildings need to be improved. All this was some of those major conclusions that was made from that report. But one of the important things that also came out of the work of America Burning was the establishment of the National Fire Incident Reporting System, also lovingly known as NFIRST. So this was established after the recommendations made in America Burning. And what it entails is that data are reported by fire departments to the US Fire Administration. And they provide information about the incidents, the equipment involved. It's a really comprehensive data system, that is for sure. And it includes approximately 75% of all fires at this point in time. So in about 1980 was where we had a good participation and started really to have data to look at. And then it has improved since, and now we're lying at around the 75% mark. So this is why we in our work are going back to 1980, because that is where we can truly rely on this data coming from the NFIRST system. But as you can see, it's only 75% of all annual fires that are collected through this. So it is not a full census. It's not all the fires in the United States. So if we wanted to have more of an idea of that, we need to look at other data sets as well. And that is where at NFPA we have some data sets that are unique to us that we're using for this. And the first one is probably the most important one in this what we're talking about here right now, and that is the Fire Experience Survey. So this is a survey of nearly 30,000 fire departments where, some high-level questions about the fire experience. We send it out every year, early in the year, to hear what had happened the year before. And what we use that for is to be able to create national estimates for the number of fires. And thereby we can then calculate the way to extrapolate from the NFIRST data to national estimates for the different numbers as we dive into the NFIRST data set. So it's a really, really important piece of information for us. But in order for us to do that, we also need a fire service inventory where we have a list of all the US fire departments and also their inventory, and really can keep a tab on what is available and who do we send this information to, etc. And then last not least, our FIDO, it's not a dog, it's our Fire Incident Data Organization, and it's all significant fire incidents and fires of technical interest. We try to be worldwide, it's not always we catch everything, but what it has all of them of is US firefighter fatalities since 1974, and all of catastrophic multiple death fires. This is fires where we see 5 or more people that have died. And then large loss fires, fires with a loss of more than $10 million. And incidents of special interest is also something that we try to keep up on. But it's not always easy with everything that's going on around the world. But these data sets, as I said, are these 3 are unique to us, and we use them together with NFIRST to really do our analytics and our research and dive deep into what is the fire problem in the US and what can we learn from these data. So let me dive into some of the fun stuff that you're all waiting for. Let's then see some of these data here. So this here is actually a figure from a report that is going to be published here in a week or 2. This is our annual fire loss in the United States, and this one has data all the way up to 2020. This is the last set of data that we have from our Fire Experience Survey. And as you can see, the number of fires over the years have gone down. It's a story of fairly good success. And I'm showing it here. The green one is outside fires. The red ones are vehicles. Blue are structure fires, and the yellow are home structure fires. And it's really interesting to see how the structure fires as well as the outside fires has gone down quite a bit over the years, though as when you look at the last 20 years, it seems to have stagnated a little bit more. Same when we look at the fire deaths by incident type, also here from 1980 to 2020. And again, we are looking at structure fires, home structures, vehicles, outside fires, and others. And as you can see, we see most of our fire deaths in structure fires, and most of these are in the home structure fires. So that is truly where our fire problem lies. And if we want to minimize and reduce even further, we will have to tackle the home structure fire challenge. Now, as you will notice on this graph, we have the extreme number of 2001. We have just this weekend had the memorial service 20 years since September 11th. So that is the spike that was caused by the number of people that perished during the fire at September 11th. So overall, though, it looks like stories of success, number of fires going down, number of fire deaths going down, but it definitely looks like there's something still, the home structures is really where the story lies. So let's, so what we decided to do was really to focus in on that home fire problem. And what we did was we looked at it through what we call the NFPA fire and life safety ecosystem. If you want to learn more of the ecosystem, I've put the web address there where you can get all the good detailed information. It'll be a half-hour presentation on its own. If I was going to go into it, so I won't go into detail, but what it is a framework for safety, and it's made up of those 8 key elements that play a critical role in fire and life and electrical safety. So it's government responsibility, development and use of current codes and reference standards, investment in safety, skilled workforce, code compliance, preparedness, emergency response, and informed public. And I think you can all agree these are all very important pieces of creating a safety ecosystem. As I said, I wanted to zoom in on home fires through that lens of this safety ecosystem. So now here, the numbers that I'm showing you is the fire rates per 1,000 population and deaths per million population. And that looks even better because, you know, our population has increased in the United States since 1980. So if we now look at it per population based, the picture looks even better than it did before. And this is why, you know, through my job and through my career, when I argue we need to focus more on fire safety, we need to do more. People have been referring to figures like this and saying, hey, Birgitte, what's the problem? The numbers are going down. So why are you so, why do we need to pay attention to this when we have so many other problems in the world that we need to deal with? And it's easy to fall into that kind of complacency around fire safety. But this is why it's important that we understand what these numbers tells us, so we realize, well, there's still work to do. And one of the things that I think is really important to understand when we're looking at this home fire problem is that not all homes are created equal. So what we did is we looked at the deaths per 1,000 fires instead. Before we looked at it per 1,000 population. Now we're looking at the deaths per 1,000 fires to see how have that developed over time. And we're talking here about reported home fires. That means that a fire that is big enough to be reported to the fire service and thereby become part of the data system. We are all aware that there's a lot of fires happening in homes that are never reported to the fire service because people have taken care of them themselves. These are not part of this work. This is fires that are big enough to require a fire department response. So looking at that, we suddenly see an interesting pictures. Going back to 1980, the deaths per 1,000 fires were about the same whether it was 1 or 2 family homes or apartments. But over the time, those two graphs have separated quite significantly. So that nowadays, actually, if you live in an apartment and you have a fire that's big enough to be reported, then you are of a less of a risk of dying in that fire compared to 1980. But if you look at a 1 or 2 family home, the risk is actually higher. And that was a bit of a shock to us to realize, like, okay, we apparently have something going on in the 1 and 2 family home space that we need to look at. So we then started looking into, well, what is it that has caused these, generally the number of fire and fire death to decrease over the years, to see if we could get an idea of why is it that those two numbers are divergent between apartments and 1 and 2 family homes. And first of all, we looked at the impact of fire protection technologies. And here, this is from studies that's been done over the years at NFPA and others, look at the growth in home smoke alarm usage. And as you can see, if you remember the graph of the number of fires going down and fire deaths going down, and you're looking at here the number of smoke alarm usage going up, you would see that those two, it fits pretty well. As the usage of smoke alarms went up, the number of fires and fire deaths went down. There is no doubt that the usage of smoke alarms is one of our biggest success stories in fire safety. We just got to make sure that they're functioning and use the new fresh batteries, etc. Otherwise they will not function the way they're supposed to. But when they do, we do see a huge impact. And looking at fire protection technologies, the active type of fire protection technologies in general, we looked at, then again, the deaths per 1,000 fires. If we had no alarms or no extinguishing systems present in homes, you had the highest deaths per 1,000 fires. If we added at least battery operated alarms, but still no extinguishing, it went down. Any alarm, but still no extinguishing, down a bit further. Hardwired alarm, really good. Now we really bring the numbers down. And down in the end, we have added the extinguishing systems as well. And the picture is clear that, as we are adding these fire protection technologies to our buildings, we see less and less deaths per 1,000 fires. It has an impact to do this. And if then we look at the difference between the buildings, the type of building, as I said, we looked at the difference between 1 and 2 family homes and apartment buildings. So the taller the buildings, the more fire protection we see in these buildings. And that goes for active as well as passive. We see much more compartmentation, etc., the taller the building compared to 1 and 2 family homes. And we dove into some of the other interesting data sets that we have available to us. So one of them was an American housing survey where we looked at, well, how many of these occupied homes actually have sprinklers? And you can see as we get to apartment buildings with more and more units, more and more sprinklers, more and more likely that we have sprinkler presence in the buildings. So it really proves a point. Taller buildings, more fire protection. More fire protection means less deaths per 1,000 fires. So it really goes together hand in hand. And if we again zoom in more on these residential high-rise buildings, it was interesting to look at, the flame damage. If we look back in the 80s to the early 90s, the flame damage was confined to the object or room of origin. In 97% of fires back then, when we had extinguishing systems present, and 92%, if not, no such protection. And in 2014 to 2018, those numbers had gone up a bit. So 98% actually was confined if we had the automatic extinguishing, and 95% if we didn't. So what this shows me is that, well, compartmentation is successful in limiting the size of fire, but adding the automatic sprinklers confine even more fires. And one of the other parts of this that I found really interesting was when we looked at the deaths. So when we look at the deaths in sprinklered high-rise apartments, 89% of those happened where the fire did not spread beyond the room of origin. And I know there's people even in my organization who said there was deaths happening in sprinklered buildings. Yes, it does happen, and it happens when, it can happen in these situations where the fire do not spread beyond the room of origin, because it's often people intimate with ignition, where it's even when the sprinkler activates, it's too late. But we can see that when we see deaths happening in sprinkler to high-rise apartments, most of them are close to the ignition source. Whereas if you go for unsprinkled high-rise buildings, this number drops down to 61%, which means that all the others are dying far further away from the fire, showing that the fire has a larger impact on the rest of the building, being more deadly to a bigger area. So it's the decrease in fire deaths in high-rise buildings that follows the increase in use of sprinklers. So really the layered safety between the passive and active systems, it works. So after having looked at that and really dived into that, our conclusion was that the most successful recipe for fire safety in the built environment is the implementation of fire safety technologies, whether active or passive, through mandated codes and standards. It's the moment it becomes a mandated codes and standards, we could really see that difference as it came into the standards, and we saw, for instance, smoke alarms being much more adopted. The impact is there, so it really is a government responsibility to make sure that those technologies are implemented and that they have the right codes and standards, they have the right regulation in place. So I think that's an extremely important lesson for us to learn. Now, I've talked about what we can regulate, which is the buildings, and us as engineers, we like things that we can control and make a nice standard for and so on, and it makes life a lot easier. Now I'm going to talk about all those other soft parts of fires, which are the things we cannot control to the same extent, because it's about people and their behavior to a large extent. So looking at the home fire victims, we also saw some interesting developments in that. We saw that since 1980, the percentage of home fire victims that are under 5 years old has gone down significantly, and that reduction in that number of fire deaths for the very young has really followed the introduction of a standard for making cigarette lighters childproof. So a little simple change in a product that caused some challenges has had major impact. But sadly, and especially because I am way closer to being 65 than under 5, I am very sad to see that for our older generation, they are now making up a bigger part of the home fire victims. And that was a bit surprising and shocking for us to see. And looking at the risk of fire deaths, looking again at those soft things, those things that are not as easy to regulate, and which is, has to do with life. And we find very clearly there's a link between risk of fire death and disability, poverty, smoking, rural living, and living alone. And if you think back to our older people being more and more part of the fire victim pool, it's not so surprising since we have more and more of them living alone. That was other data we looked into. You can dig into all of that in the report. Higher number of disability, and you also see generally more smokers in the older generation. So it's not surprising that it's going the way it is, but it's something we need to do something about. So then what is it that causes the most common causes of the home fires? Because let's tell some other interesting stories about how we live and how we behave. And as you can see here, we're looking at the fires and the fire deaths. And smoking materials are still the major killer, no matter, even though it's gone down, the number of fires and fire deaths from smoking, it is still our #1 killer, sadly. But what is really interesting when you look at these numbers, so the blue numbers are not from 1980, the yellow bars are 2018. look at cooking. Cooking has more fires and more fire deaths now than in 1980. And I think that's really interesting to see. And if we, it literally is the only major cause that shows more fires and fire deaths now compared to 1980. And if we think about that, smoking is a chosen behavior, cooking is something we all do. It is something that is so essential for us to be able to survive. We need food, but it's also something that's often connected to comfort and feeling a certain amount of pleasure in life. Cooking is really important, and yet we have not solved the cooking fire problem. It's getting worse. We still have a lot to do here in order to figure out how can we solve this problem. Another interesting is the role of our furniture. It's another, maybe not so much a behavioral thing, other than, we want our comfort. Hey, come on, I like a comfortable bed with my big, thick foam mattress. I like my comfortable couch that I can dive into when I'm watching TV or whatever at the end of the day. So we like our comforts. But what we also see that those comfortable furnitures are becoming more and more part of our fire experience. Looking again here at data from 1980 to 84 and 2014 to 2018, the blue ones are the 1980s data, the yellow are the 2014 to 2018 data. We see that the deaths per 1,000 fires that began in upholstered furniture, mattresses and bedding has gone up. And if we look at in the rooms where we normally see these kind of furniture, living room and bedroom, we see that those number of deaths per 1,000 fires in those rooms have also gone up. Whereas in the kitchen, where we do see a larger proportion of the fires, have gone down a little bit. So there is no doubt that furniture plays a role. And I think, all the great work that was done by UL showing the impact of modern furniture compared to legacy furniture truly gives an idea of how fast it can go when fire can take hold in some of our furniture. So very interesting to see. We still have to solve this because, some of the first solution created other problems. So we got to make sure that we can solve the fire problem without creating other problems long term. And now I want to change over to something that looking at more the catastrophic fires. So as I said, we have kept track of fires that killed 5 or more people for the last 40 to 50 years, and have that in our FIDO data set. And it's really interesting to look at it over the years and see what has changed. So here we're looking, what we're showing on this figure are the deaths from non-vehicle fires that are killing 10 or more people. And different colors are different occupancy types. And what we have excluded here are the deaths related to terrorist attacks. So the Oklahoma City bombing and September 11th, 2001 are not shown in the figure, just so you are aware. But what is interesting to see is that we have a few what we call the assembly / nightclub type fires. There was the Happy Land in 1990. In New York, we had the Station nightclub fire in 2003 in Rhode Island, and then we had Ghost Ship in California in 2016. These tend to be some really significant big events. But otherwise, if we then look at the other types of occupancy, homes has a low, consistent presence here. But what is not having a consistent presence is like nursing home, board and care. We have the last of those in 2000 and early 2000s. We don't have big hospital fires on this list. And what we do get, and we get more and more of, as you see, the light green color, is wildland urban interface fires. These are now becoming the major killers. So we've gone from these, what was typical perceived as the high risks of hospitals, high-rise buildings, hotels, nursing homes, and so on. You don't see them on this figure. And to the same extent, they're slowly. We don't have catastrophic fires. Knock on wood. I always nervous saying that. Fear jinx myself. But looking at the data, we have done a good job on that. Where our next area to focus is truly the wildland-urban interface. And these are data from last year. We don't yet have the cost of the fires that are happening in California at the moment, but there is no doubt that these numbers will change as we have the numbers for 2021. But when we looked at it, when we made this study, 7 of the 10 costliest fires in the US were fires in the WUI, and 5 were in 2015 or later. These fires are getting bigger and more destructive and affecting more people. And it's really something that we need to focus on a lot more. All right, I've been talking quite a bit, and I should leave some time for some questions as well. So let me slowly start wrapping it up. So what have we learned through this? And there's a lot more detail in the report and other little tidbits on other things and so on. But I tried to give you a high-level introduction to our work here. So what have we learned? Well, we have been successful in bringing down the number of fire and fire deaths. And nobody's surprised about that. We've seen the numbers over the years, and we have been successful in that, and that is really great. What has had the most obvious impact? Back to the whole spiel and analysis I did on the difference between apartment buildings and 1 and 2 family homes and the impact of smoke alarms and fire protection technologies in general. We can really see that the most obvious impact does come from government responsibility in this fire and life safety ecosystem, and making sure that you have the appropriate standard codes and standards in place. And then in addition to that, an informed public, because the public needs also to be aware that some of these fire safety technologies, you cannot, take the battery out of your smoke alarm just because it beeps when you cook bacon and then not replacing it. You have to take responsibility yourself as well for some of this. So it's really important to have an informed public as well. So these, as we looked at the data, were the areas of the fire and life safety ecosystem where we could see the most obvious impact. But I think it's also important to really look at the investing in safety. And this, if we go back there to the ecosystem, it relates to what we talk about related to code compliance and a skilled workforce. Nightclub fires, as I talked about, the Station nightclub or the Ghost Ship or some of the many other nightclub fires around the world. These are typical example of lack of code compliance, doing, things that shouldn't have been done. And it's a lack of investment in fire safety technologies, choosing not to add sprinklers to these nightclubs. It's terrible. It happens again and again, and it's almost always the same thing that's behind these catastrophic fires. But we also have to think about this as an issue in many home fires. Again, going back to the operating smoke alarms. It's investment of time of checking your smoke alarm. Sometimes a little money with a battery if that needs. It's the using untrained people to do electrical and heating work, and I know if you are low on money, you might not be able to afford having somebody who's certified. But that is where you start then putting yourself at a higher risk. And old homes can have inadequate wiring for today's needs and will need that extra investment to bring it up to code. So it's really, really essential actually to consider this investing in safety. And to some of the discussions I know that you're having in the UK as well after Grenfell in 2017, the whole part of competency is a big part of this as well, that we ensure that we have a skilled workforce all the way from the designer to the installers, to the people that are doing the maintenance as the building is in place. we cannot just build it and let it go, or even design it and then not make sure it's installed correctly. It all works together to create the safety, and it's really important that we focus on that investment. Then, of course, as I said, we need to focus on our seniors. They have an increasing share of fire fatalities, more of them living alone, high rate of disabilities, and often also living in older homes. So as I said, I'm much closer to being a senior than a teenager. So this is something very close to my heart, and I, believe that it's something we must focus on next. And last but not least, the wildfire problem. This is getting bigger. We are seeing higher losses, yet we are putting more and more people out in the wildland-urban interface. And we cannot fight all these fires. I mean, look how many is going on in California at the moment. It's the West Coast in general. It's crazy. And an informed public, that's a good start. We've done a lot of really, really great work from NFPA side with the FireWise program, getting people to think about having their properties well maintained and prepared and so on. But we need to do more. So I'm very proud of an initiative that NFPA started called Outthink Wildfire, really to try and put wildfire action policies here in the US. And I encourage you all to consider that. I mean, I know the UK normally don't think of wildfire as a huge problem, but it is there, and you guys will see it, and you'll probably see it more and more over the years, unfortunately. So I'm proud of the step we have taken with that from NFPA's side. And that brought me to the end, which is good because I'm close to losing my voice. So Matt, that was it.
Woo!
Thank you.
We have to do that. That's the problem with webinars now. I have to applaud on behalf of the remote audience. But yeah, no, that was really fascinating. Thank you very much for that presentation. We've got a few questions, so hopefully you'll be able to answer a few of these. Going from the top, Guillermo wanted to know if you could mention more about the smoking material fires that you mentioned before as one category where fire risk is going up. I don't know if you have more information about them.
I mean, we do. We actually have a whole report on smoking fires, I think, somewhere. So the interesting thing is that the number of fires and fire deaths are going down when it comes to smoking, but it's still the leading cause, and that's worrying. What we are starting to see, we don't really have the detailed data to totally show it, but we are seeing more and more fires happening from people smoking outside. So where the classical smoking fires used to be somebody in a bed or a chair or whatever dropping a cigarette, right? Now it's not unusual to have the fires where somebody's been standing out on the porch or the balcony or the backyard smoking and dropping the cigarette into a planter or the nice little planting next to the building, and it starts a smoldering fire that starts a fire next in the building. We've actually seen some really sad incidents related to that. So while we still have the old classic smoking fire problem, we might have something new. And then, of course, we can't pin out the challenges that comes with some of the newer ways of smoking, with vaping and all that. That's a whole other ball of wax that we have not yet gotten into. So that's as much as I can answer you, Guillermo.
Yeah. So is that all? And so that entire category is like to do with smoking, as in hand smoking. It's not other kinds of I don't know, naturally smoldering materials or something, like a barbecue or something. I don't know.
No, it's called smoking materials. So it is about cigarette smoking or cigar smoking or whatever your fancy is, right? So cool. The other ones are they're called barbecue and grill fires or whatever. Yeah.
Cool. Just checking. Francesco says, thank you for the really interesting presentation, and that well done the NFPA for doing a great job informing the public. Although he wonders if you have any advice about how we, I guess the fire community, can do a better job globally of informing the population of fire risks and sort of general fire safety awareness?
Well, that's I think we need to have programs that are directed specifically to, you have targeted programs. If we're too general to broad, I don't think it's going to help. So for instance, if I take a program that we have done in the United States on cooking fire safety, and I try to use that in Africa, it's not going to work, because it's different ways of doing things. So I think the most important for us as a fire safety community is truly to understand our audience and understand the people that we are trying to save and make life safer for them, in order to be able to tailor our messages in a way that they will understand them and they'll meet their needs. Sometimes I feel, and I'm guilty of it myself, that we are speaking up here, very high level, and people cannot relate to that. They're standing with my here and now problem. So it's how can I solve that? And we have to learn to bridge that gap. And I'm finding more and more that working together with social scientists, that is a really interesting way to better understand that. I think we fire protection people need to branch out. The fire safety community needs to branch out. I've argued that for a long time, so that we don't just stay in our fire safety bubble, but we understand some of the other things that are going on around us. So we make sure that the communications on all of this are done in a way that people can understand it. Yeah,
I think reminds me of Guillermo's thing about that he said when we joined about half the job of science is doing the science part, but half of it is also making sure that it actually gets people know what you found, and if you've only done half the job, it's not really, you've not done it. But thank you, that's a really interesting answer. In fact, there was a suggestion here by someone, which is saying, do you think you could enforce the use of induction stoves as a way of decreasing the risk of fire, removing like flaming stoves? I'm not sure whether you have any data that suggests that.
Well, I think it's a really interesting comment, because it picks on some of the things we just talked about. So it's like, yeah, wouldn't that be great if we could do that? We don't have data that induction stove cooking is particularly safer, but I think there are technologies to help, especially with any electrical cooked tops to make them safer. The problem is, as I said, fire risk is often linked to poverty and other things.
Yeah.
So we could make that mandatory to do that, but it will take maybe 20 years before it's trickled down into all parts of society. And that brings me to a whole other thing that I often be like, we got to be careful we don't just do fire safety for those that can afford it.
Yeah.
So so whereas I have a lot of sympathy for that comment, I think it really brings us into, we have to remember, so, well, how big would that impact actually be? Well, it would help the people who already are doing pretty good, but it won't help the people where we truly see some of the problems. And that's where we need to think how to reach both.
Do you have any ideas? Because there's a question, the next question is kind of very much on the same topic, which is just saying, like, do you think why certain groups, rural and poor groups, are more affected by fire risk? And they suggest, oh, should we be targeting groups with education? But do you just have any general ideas that any ideas about how you could possibly help those groups more from a fire safety perspective?
Yeah, I think that is truly where community risk reduction comes in, and understanding the community that you're in to be able to, as I said before, do that kind of targeted approach to people, because otherwise it's it's just going to fall on deaf ears. we've just published a report on the link between fire risk and poverty that you'll be able to find on our research website as well, that are dealing with some of these challenges. And what is interesting to see that some of the challenges that we would deal with in poverty in a country like the United States are not so different than some of the challenges that are dealt with in refugee camp somewhere or an informal settlement somewhere else. It can be anything from using interesting things for cooking, homemade wood stoves, not making construction products that you've just found to be able to do some things quickly and easy, and it's truly is about getting to know the community and try to help with the risk reduction. But I don't have a formula for how to. Unfortunately, as engineers, we wish we did, right? But that's why I'm excited about all the initiatives that are going on around the world related to community risk reduction.
Yeah, so it's kind of like more of you can't really prescribe like a general solution. It's got to be like tailored to each specific one, which makes a lot of sense. Which is always the problem when you're looking at like statistics, right? It's always like very broad overview, but like it removes a lot of individual complexity there. We've got a last question from Vasilis, or another question from Vasilis here. It says, again, thank you very much for the interesting presentation. He was interested in regard to cooking fires, if there's a way to distinguish between fires that happened by accident during routine cooking, or versus ones that are more to do with, like, let's say, like someone drunk, or like sort of not being in a state where they should be cooking in the first place. And he says similar for smoking, basically, is like there a difference between sort of sober people and people who've had their cognition inhibited in some way.
I wish there was. I wish that through the data we would be able to do that. And even though the NFPA data set is so detailed, unfortunately, it's not detailed enough to be able to totally pin that out. This is why we have, for a long time, tried to gather information on some of these fires by contacting the fire service and actually then getting more detailed information around some of these fires to see if we could get a better idea of what it is that's going on. But from, unfortunately, not a statistical sample big enough in order for us to say, yeah, so many percentage are because they were, under the influence, etc. But there's no doubt that that is part of the problem, that it's people that are starting to cook and then, either under the influence of something, whether it is, alcohol, illegal drugs, or legal drugs. I mean, it's even, some fairly non-extreme legal drugs can make you drowsy. So it happens, unfortunately. Yes. Or
just being drowsy is sometimes can happen. Yeah.
And then let's forget little kids, because or animals. I mean, you're standing there cooking, and your kids are suddenly getting into trouble somewhere else in the house, and you're running to do that while you forgot to turn off the cooking. It happens.
Yeah. I've got another question here. This just asking if the NFPA has ever tried to lobby for the introduction of mandatory fire risk courses for high schools. I guess the question is, do you think that would be effective? I'm not. Yeah.
You know what? I would love that. I'll bring that back to our policy institute. I mean, we do our fire prevention week every year. It's coming up here next month, and provide a lot of educational material to school-age children. Most of them, though, more preschool or elementary school level.
Right. Yeah.
But I completely agree with whoever asked that question, saying it'd be great to repeat that as you get into the high school level. I would love to do that. I actually was, having grown up in Denmark and never had a fire safety course in my school career ever, except for when I started university, but that was then an engineering course, but not a general basic how to behave in fire. We never had that. And then see my son grow up here in the United States, and already in preschool, the fire department came and visited, and they got to see the firefighter in the gear, and they talked about stop, drop, and roll, and all these things. I was so impressed with that kind of education. I think it's critical, and I think not enough countries are doing it.
Yeah. I definitely think as well, like when I met with one of this Canadian professor, John, he was talking to us about the history of fire safety in the UK, and I think like that's something which definitely brings a whole element which I think people love in terms of like stories of how all the work that's been done to try and make things a bit safer. Because I think when you just get told a lot about evacuation all the time as a child, I was definitely phasing out a lot, whereas when you're going like, no, people have really worked hard to try and so you don't die in a fire, can you please respect some of these? That would be good.
And we actually found another problem, and that was that some of the kids, they're 5 years old, right? And they learn this stop, drop, and roll. That's what they're supposed to do if their clothes is on fire. But they just say fire, stop, drop, and roll.
Oh,
so instead of evacuating, they stop, drop, and roll. I was like, okay, we need to teach this a little different.
Yeah.
So cute though.
It's cute. Can imagine that. Another anonymous question here. Thank you for the presentation. In the beginning of the presentation, you mentioned you worked on public affairs, and it was how was the experience transitioning to that from a technical background beforehand? How do you find that?
Extremely interesting and extremely educational, because that is truly where I learned that you need to be able to communicate all that technical knowledge to people who have none or very little. And I also realized how much our policymakers need good information and good science-based information given to them in a way that they can use it directly in their work. So it was something I truly loved to do, and would be happy to do again, because I think it's really important.
Is there any like particular resources you use to help you, or that you'd recommend to the audience, or?
Well, when I used to not work at NFPA, already then I actually used a lot of NFPA stuff. So what I would recommend is to use like the information that I just provided you here today in that kind of report. That is the kind of information I would take, so that when you're met with that, well, fire safety has already been solved because we've seen the number goes down, and say, well, look at this, there's something beneath the numbers. That data, always data, is a really important part. And then another thing where I think we as a fire community still lacking a little bit behind is to be able to speak in dollars, because as much as I am very passionate about preventing all fire deaths and fire injuries, policymakers also look at it in dollars or euros, and we have to be better at trying to see what is the economic impact of these events, because even if we have less fires, some of them are actually very, very costly to us. We also have to look at what fires, how they impact other areas like the environment, long-term impacts of that, long-term health impacts on our fire and rescue service, etc. So it's there's a lot of things to dive into that can help bringing the case forward to policymakers.
No, I think that's an interesting point about sort of you need quite a broad range of statistics, different groups that are interested in different parts of it, and that's something to remember. It actually kind of leads me on to my last question, which is just from me, because I've done quite a bit of work with statistics and stuff in the past in my PhD, and I'm working on a project now with more of it. And certainly, if I was going back to talk to myself at the beginning of my PhD, I'd have so many things to say that I'd learned on the way. So just wondering if, like, doing this project, you have any sort of advice for people doing their own analysis of fire statistics, if there were any pitfalls you fell into along the way or anything you'd advise people to think about before they start.
Well, this is actually, as I said, most of the statistical and data work here was done by Marty Ahrens, because she knows what she's doing. If I was doing it, it would not be good. I will be honest.
Find someone else as your top advice.
Exactly. So my advice is make sure you have the statistical knowledge to do it, because you can do a lot of crap stuff with numbers. A little fun tidbit is that the course I hated the most at university was statistics. And now I'm working with all these numbers and so on. So I'm very happy to be working with some very smart people that can help me.
Yeah, no, that's fair. That's good. Well, thank you very much, and thank you for answering all these questions. It's really interesting getting insight into some of the statistics changing. I'll have to get in contact with the person who was doing the data analysis as well. It'd be interesting to get some of that side too. But I think this had a really clear story to it, and it was really interesting stuff to think about. So thank you for coming, and thank you all for listening. We really appreciate it. As I say, if you'd like to see more of our webinars, you can follow us on Twitter at SFP London. We're also on LinkedIn, the SFP Greater London Student Chapter. We've got a website, if you Google that, and you can find all our past webinars there, and hopefully you'll be able to find this one as well, if we get permission or that. So thank you very much for coming. Thank you, Birgitte, for talking, and I hope you'll have a fantastic week. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, Matt. Bye.